just a very warm welcome to this afternoon with Jo. And my name is Nikki, for those of you that don't know me, and I head up the Institute for Creative Conversation in Benoni, teaching and facilitating narrative practices and ideas as well. So it's a wonderful honor, long-time colleague, to be able to introduce you to Jo. I think many of you in the room are already familiar with Jo and the wonderful work that she does at Coram Deo and at Simca Recovery and just in the world around her. So it's good to have you with us this afternoon, Jo. Thank you for your time. Perhaps we can just dive right in, and I'm aware from previous conversations we've had of an initial background in clinical psychiatric nursing. And then at some point you discovered narrative and kind of went on a journey of learning with narrative. But I'm curious about what led you to reach out to narrative approaches and then to be responded to by David Epstein. What was that link?
Okay, so Nikki, hi, thank you so much for having me. It's such a privilege, and I hope that whatever I share today will be useful for others. My career as a nurse was really not my preferred way of being. My nursing career was not the brightest part of my life. I really didn't enjoy it until after the basic nursing, I started in psychiatry, and there I felt, okay, hang on a sec, this is something I could do. And many years later, whilst working night shift at a clinic in Pretoria, I met Professor Dirk Kotze, and he offered a short course in genograms or family constellations. And I joined that, and really I felt that this was different. The way he spoke, the way he thought, and then he spoke about the master's degree. And I just felt that what he offered could take me into more effective and more helpful conversations than my previous nursing experience did. And I went on a journey and eventually completed a master's with ITD. And then I couldn't stop. So I went on to complete a PhD at the Department of Religious Studies. So that happened 20 years ago. It's amazing. If I look back, I cannot believe it's 20 years ago. Yeah. And after my studies, I worked part-time in the clinic, and with a PhD especially, I worked part-time and studied part-time until it was completed. And during one night, do you want me to carry on? You want me to ramble on? So yes, during one night shift, when I came on shift, the day staff said, oh, really, you're going to have a hell of a night of it, because this one woman was admitted and she nearly broke the place down. But don't worry, we've sedated her, so she should sleep through the night. And I was fine. I mean, I could check on her. She was asleep. She was calm. And here at 2 o'clock in the morning, I heard this soft noise in front of me. And here stood this magnificent woman, obviously dressed in crumpled clothing, both hands sutured, arms sutured, with a cup of coffee for each one of us, which is really against clinic rules. You know, you cannot drink Jacob's coffee at 2 o'clock in the morning. But I wasn't going to make a fuss. And we started chatting, and I discovered this most amazing woman. And she discovered my most amazing first 2 narrative books. And she wanted to know what this is all about. And the only thing I knew then was externalization. So yes, we played a bit of a game with externalization until she was tired and she went back to bed. And unknown to me, she discussed this new approach of therapy with her husband. And they thought this externalization idea is amazing. And they asked me to be their community therapist. And I immediately declined it, because I really, honestly, guys, I had no idea what I was doing. It was like month 2 of my master's. and an introduction to this. But somehow we decided we'll collaborate and we'll learn this together. I had no idea what I was letting myself in for. As time progressed and as my local professors guided me, we did the narrative practices. You know, we externalized, we looked for unique outcomes, we did a lot of documentation, but somehow I always felt as though I missed something. I couldn't put my finger on it because this whole idea of the client is the expert weighed very heavily on me. And I could see signs of disturbed eating, and I'd bring it up and she'd say, no, we've sorted that. I sorted that when I was 16. There's no anorexia now. But the self-harm took the limelight. So we would make great progress, and then something would happen tiny at home, and she would cut herself, and it was very dramatic and overdose, and really that she didn't die in any of these attempts it was a miracle. And one night I came back from an emergency call, and I sat in my office and I thought, you know what, my local professor said I cannot carry on with this woman because I must refer her. You know, I'm not, and I knew I wasn't skilled enough to do any further therapy with her. And then I just thought, you know, you guys thought this up. Somebody's got to help me. And I wrote an email addressed to a David, whoever the David may be, hoping it would be David Epstein, because I had met him at a conference before when he was in South Africa. And I explained the story, and I said, this woman is really going to kill herself. Please, somebody has to help me. And lo and behold, David Epstein replied to me, and they began a year-long process, which we called the virtual response team. This entailed actual equal collaboration between David, myself, and the client. She would teach us and he would teach me, and I would learn and teach them both. It was like that kind of situation. And he immediately recognized anorexia, and he didn't mention it. He was so clever because he wrote at the end of his first letter, kind regards, anti-anorexically, yours, David. She never contested that. And from opening up that concept, we were able to start naming this problem. She didn't want to refer to it as anorexia. She gave it different names. Mm-hmm. She gave it the name of self-sabotage, of self-sacrifice. Then she also abbreviated it to SS. And that had really overtones of the Nazi concentration camps and how the Nazis marched and dominated the people. So it was a very exciting journey. David was unbelievably generous. He emailed us once a day, at least, no matter where he was, whether he was in New Zealand or whether he was teaching in America or in South America. He never, ever slipped up being in contact with us. And through his letters, he taught me how to ask these questions. And what would happen in practice was we would receive a letter, I would receive it, and we would sit together, the client and I, and she'd read through it and say, no, I don't want to answer this. You know, he's off target, but this question is important. So we learned how to understand questioning, how they work, and what the effects are on people. Now, I've said enough, Nikki.
No, you haven't. You have such an interesting story to share. And so that really started, like you said, there were the three of you in conversation, the client, David Epstein, and yourself. And so what are some of the, you said he was very generous. He was generous with his time, with the way he responded. But what were some of the biggest learnings that you took away from spending that year with David?
Well, one of the biggest learnings that I still treasure is the way of asking questions. Also, the position of the therapist. I mean, he was there was no question that he was in a position of anti-anorexia. No question that he didn't internalize it. You know, in medicine, folks with a problem with eating or disturbed eating, they're often seen as non-compliant, and that they refuse to eat and that they starve themselves. There was none of that. He's firmly situated this problem in the Western societal discourses. And that to me was like an eye-opener, because the diet talk is everywhere. The thinness ideal is everywhere. He also introduced me to feminist thinking about bodies and weight. I started reading radical feminist therapists, Bonnie Burstow, where she, for example, said, if a person cuts herself, that's really her choice. We don't have the right to judge them. I was okay. You know, I asked my client, how would this work for you if the cuts are dealt with in a different way? And she said, you know, people treat me like a convict when I go to casualty. And when I say to my family and to my friends, I'm not doing well, they ignore me. And it's almost like I'm crying wolf. In the meantime, my head and my heart is a shambles. But when I cut and they see blood, then they call the ambulance. So we had to work with that. And I had to overcome the shock that I have every time when the injuries were worse. But David wasn't fazed by that at all, not at all. And the other thing he taught me through his example, what he modeled, was how to ask questions and how to stack one question after the other. Because paper is very patient. So he could write an email and have 6 questions underneath one another. And then I test them, and she would say, no, that's too much. I can't answer that. Let's just stick to these 2. But the process of asking them taught me how one question could feed into the next one, into the next one, into the next one. And also how you can bring poetry and literature and art into this whole process. So it really wasn't just this naked therapeutic process. It was wild. It was an adventure. We really were stepping into totally unknown territory. Totally. David had never done anything like this. I certainly had never done anything like this. And the client had never experienced this kind of therapy. Yeah.
So really sort of anti-establishment, anti the norm.
Totally. And he kept saying, this is terra incognita, this unknown territory. And we were all sort of standing on a limb with one foot in the air and not knowing where our foot would land. Now that I think back, if I think back on the adrenaline and the fear, and I really was, it was silly of me to carry on, because I really didn't know what I was doing, but I'm so grateful that he reached out and helped me. So his example of anti-anorexia has helped me a lot in my anti-addiction work.
Tell us a little bit about that, because I know that you are the director of Simca Recovery with Ricky, and it says an outpatient recovery program for people living with addiction.
Yeah.
So in what ways are you finding that narrative ideas and practices and the whole approach is helpful in working with people's stories of addiction?
Okay, so the whole idea of Simcha came about when Ricky and I were both involved in a residential rehabilitation center. And it was one of those 3-week jobs where you come in, you know, you're there for 3 weeks on the medical aid, and then you go out, and then there's really no community support. So Ricky actually started writing the program and started implementing it. And it's not really outpatient. We've changed the word. It's a community-based program. We've actually changed the word. It's community-based. We have no beds. We only have chairs, and you can come and sit and chat with us 3 times a week. And eventually I joined her, but she started Simcha with 2 clients and herself. It's the only narrative therapy addiction recovery program, I think, in Pretoria, certainly, and the only one in perhaps South Africa.
South Africa.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the only one. And simcha means celebration in Hebrew. And the whole idea is that we celebrate the unique outcomes. We celebrate every second without a substance or without an action in the direction of sex addiction or gambling or overeating. So we celebrate all those tiny little moments. And we found that having that as a starter point, it means that we always focus on the unique outcomes and on the preferred story. So yes, the clients would say, they often say when they come to we have a group, it's a group program. So the first time a person comes to group from movies and AA and whatever has been available before, they're very accustomed to, hello, I'm John, I am an alcoholic. And the group would listen to them. And either myself or Ricky or one of the older members would say, hang on a second, there are no alcoholics in this group. And the person would say, what, hang on, am I in the right place? You know, and we'd say, yes, but we'd love to get to know the person first. We'd love to get to know you outside of this problem. And the mere fact that we stand up against a negative identity conclusion that is common in other community-based programs. The clients experience a kind of a relief. Thank goodness I came in a room full of people that I don't know, and I didn't have to wash my dirty washing in front of everybody. So they experience it as extremely uplifting. And extremely liberating, because from day one, they are reconnected with their preferred identity.
So the labeling is taken away.
Totally.
That marginalization of I am an addict is removed, and they're almost invited into the space then, if I'm hearing you correctly, as more than. Everyone is always more than the dominant story.
Yes, absolutely. And they love that. They absolutely enjoy that. And people come to group because it becomes a part of the skeleton of their recovery. It's that connection. It's that I'm allowed to say what's going on in my life. Nobody's going to judge me. So it's a good time in the week for them to attend.
And I know that you work with a myriad of stories of addiction. So it's not just alcohol and drugs. What are some of the other addictions that?
Well, the one thing sort of flowed out of the other. Obviously, we started with addiction recovery. Then the groups got so big and became unmanageable. So we had to have 2 groups. And then we realized, but hang on a second, the family members don't understand this strange language that we speak. And the clients go home and say, it's not me, it's alcohol. And the family are saying, what's your story? You're not taking responsibility. So we then created a family care group where the therapists work with the family members and help them to understand that they are actually as affected as the person using the substance or engaging in the addictive behavior. And this has become, that's very important, because we all need to speak the same language. So that was the first extra group that happened. And then I'm going to mention his name because sadly Barney passed away from COVID, but he was the most adorable person. I don't know if you ever met Barney Bayers. He was a big guy who started with narrative. He was a big soul, a big spirit, but also a very big person. And he had struggled with his weight for his whole life. And he joined Coram Deo age 63, I think. He started with a course. And he started reading maps, and he realized, but hang on a second, I've been on these diets and doing this and doing that, and nothing ever helped me. And he externalized his problem as obese. It's a play on obesity. Okay. And working on his own, he lost 25 kilos. And then he came to me and he said, can't we please have a group? I'm sure there are other people that struggle with their weight. And Barney, he started off Agir, and Agir is a Latin word that he chose, and it means agency. So you actually have the power to change the hold that food has over you. And that program has also, it's been years that we've been running that.
Sure.
Now, very interestingly, that client that I met in the hospital 20 years ago, she is a member of Agir at the moment, as is her daughter.
Sure.
Which I think is quite a good testimony to the faith that they have in us. Then there are more addictions than merely drugs and alcohol. There's some process addictions which have a very, very negative effect on people. So gambling is a well-known one, but gambling is also very culturally entrenched. Hey? Tata my chance. You know, we all want to tata my chance and become a millionaire. So we have the people who struggle with gambling are commonly included in our recovery group, because whether it's gambling, or whether it's sex addiction, or whether it's alcohol, or whether it's cocaine, the process is the same. Okay, the addictive process, the process in the brain, the cravings of the effect of it is the same. So very often we refer generically to the problem as the problem. When people feel that they want to speak about that cocaine, they're more than welcome to. But from that flowed the need for a support group for the wives of men who are trapped in a porn addiction or a sex addiction. And so I think it's 3 years ago, we put out an ad and said, are there any women who have experienced this? And I think within 3 days, the group was full.
Sure.
And we now meet, it was interesting, we called ourselves initially Facing Heartbreak, Facing Forward, based on one of the books that we used. And then they said, no, they don't like that. And we went from one word to the other. And eventually the ladies settled on the warriors. So we have the warrior group on a Saturday morning. In fact, we're having one tomorrow. And it is just the most amazing community of concern that I have ever come across. Yeah. So the warrior group is a warm, safe place where you can share these intimate details of your life that you cannot share with your mother, your sister, or anybody out there, because the stigma of a sex addiction is so massive.
Yeah.
Okay. So we've got the recovery groups, we've got the family care groups, we've got Agir, we've got warriors, and I'm sure I must be missing one out. But COVID, of course, came along, and so we now have 2 Zoom groups as well.
So yeah, so we've had to in order to stay
We've
relevant,
had to adjust.
We've had to adjust.
Yeah.
And I was reading a couple of days ago an article about the influence of COVID on addictive behaviors with technology.
Massive.
It has been one of the ways that we've had to stay in contact, and for some people it's become it resembles an addiction to
it is an addiction.
As well. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. The addiction to technology, I was just discussing it today with someone, that every beep that you get, every ping that you get on your phone, every WhatsApp that comes through that alerts you, ignites a little bit of dopamine. Says, hello, this is like, oh, I like this. And people can't believe that way back when you could travel from Pretoria to Cape Town without a phone. I mean, let alone now going from home to buy bread and milk. Oh my word, I left my phone at home. The sky is going to fall. So in a way, we're all very dependent on technology. And I think we have to be honest with ourselves that it actually has become an extension of our bodies. And it's dangerous. You know where the biggest danger lies, and this is what the clients tell me, is when they perhaps long ago were introduced to pornography. It was like a scope where the girlies had stars on their boobs. or Daddy's magazine or Uncle's magazine. So it was printed media, and you could look at it and put it away. But now, with everybody running around with cell phones, and with YouTube being widely available to everyone, I mean, kids, little kids in primary school are exposed to images and videos that harm them terribly, and movies that harm them terribly. And parents, very often parents don't pay attention to the age restrictions.
Yeah.
And the effect on a young person's mind is their development is such that there are times when they cannot separate fantasy from reality. They experience it as if it was happening. So I shudder to think what life is going to look like in terms of tech addiction in the future, and especially with lockdown.
Yes.
Everybody's stuck to it. So folks that have this problem, it's very difficult for them to work in lockdown without having the substance in front of them, because that's their mode of earning.
That's right. Yeah. And for youngsters, you know, having a cell phone in front of them and trying to, or maybe adults as well, but my concern is for youngsters trying to conduct relationships, and the sexting, the underage pornography almost that is happening through this. Do you offer support for teenagers and children as well as,
you know, we have
adults?
That is our ideal for our next group. Teenagers need very specialized care. And Hanli, I know, is running a course, she has been for a while, on teen therapy. And she's actually specializing in teens. So for now, I would refer them to her, because we don't have a group program for kids. You cannot include kids with addictions in the same program as adults with addictions. So you're actually not allowed to do that by law. So I would refer all the kids to her and to the people that she's training in that field.
Okay. All right. If anybody who's with us has a question for Jo, please feel free to type it in the chat box, and we will ask some of those, and Jo will answer for us as well. But I'm curious about, and I know that being a narrative practitioner myself, I know the difference in the therapeutic environment. But how would you respond to the cynicism in the world around addiction, the kind of the comments that get made, once an addict, always an addict? How would narrative respond to that?
Well, narrative knows that addictive substances, first it was just alcohol, you know, alcohol was normalized, it's still normalized. And this is where our clients struggle, because when you go to a braai, there's alcohol. When you go to a wedding, there's alcohol. So the invitations for them to go back to the substance is just everywhere. It's just everywhere. So, and this is where David helped me to understand that this problem can hitchhike along with the client forever. And its voice is in the client's ear forever. Because the invitations from the world that we live in makes it okay. It makes it okay. And when they were able to advertise alcohol, remember those ads, people were gorgeous and tall and handsome and happy and on a boat somewhere. Yeah, they were rich and they were dancing. And they always show those half-truths. I mean, a half-truth is a great thing because it sounds like the real truth. But the other side of the coin is casualty on a Friday and a Saturday night with alcohol-induced injuries and domestic violence injuries. So our clients understand this, and we understand that the alcohol it's been normalized, it's been actually elevated in our society, that it's something that you have to have. And from our approach, we identify the voice, we identify the intention. We don't internalize it in the person, because this problem, this voice will follow a person forever. I had a client who, that was in the rehabilitation inpatient center. He came in one February, and he was an older man, and he said that he became sober 20 years ago. He was like totally sober, and went to visit his mom over Christmas and felt too like scum to not eat her Christmas cake, which was soaked in brandy. And he came back after Christmas, after New Year. New Year, he started drinking champagne. And when he came back to Pretoria, he started drinking Lennons to try and rationalize, I'm not feeling lekker, so I'm going to drink the Lennons. And then one day he said he sat there with 4 bottles of Lennons. And he thought, this stuff is so foul, I might as well go and buy the whiskey. And then the relapse was massive. So the problem will haunt you and try and get you back, because the intention of the problem is not just to get you. It would love to destroy you, your family, your community, your street. It would just like to take over. So that's how we approach it. That alcohol is around because it's entrenched in our culture.
And it is. I mean, I was just wondering, some of the ways that addiction recruits us into participating, those Friday night braais, or celebrating with champagne.
Yes. I mean, God forbid you have a wedding without champagne. I mean, really, how can you have an engagement party without champagne? I mean, what's wrong with you? And who made those rules? Where does it come from? And then we've also learned that the drugs and the alcohol take hands. So it is the truth that when people go out drinking and they think they've had too much to drink, then they start using stimulants to try and sober up. And they might feel more sober, but now they are high and drunk. So they're doubling the danger.
And so then people, that, of course, that leads to casual sex and all sorts of others.
Exactly.
Habits.
So they'd come to recovery and they'd say, well, okay, my problem is cocaine. Alcohol's not my problem. But in the recovery process, they realize that the minute they start drinking, it opens the doors, because now they don't have all that much choice anymore. And very often it would lead to a using of cocaine or cat or whatever meth, whatever their drug of choice was. So these things are very strongly interwoven. And then, of course, prescription medication addiction.
Yes.
That's massive. That's massive. In the times that we live and the stress that people have, it's huge.
Yeah. And a lot of it appears to be quite easy to come by as well. We've heard the saying that doctors prescribe certain antidepressants like Smarties, so that's also part of that culture that recruits into forming
absolutely
habits.
Nikki, are the dogs bothering you? Should I put my sound off and maybe you can speak to someone in the chat room for a moment?
No, not at all.
Is it okay?
It's absolutely okay. So in Tabileng writes, and yes, it's even the ways in which religion recruits us into addiction, serving sacramental wine.
Yes. I think most churches have become clued up, and there's always a grape juice now. But yes, religious ceremonies that include alcohol, and not just, African traditions. There's a lot of African beer that gets consumed because it's part of the ritual. That's hard for people. The other thing that's important is the legalization of dacha.
And there's a question or a comment actually on that in the chat. Eloise says, I have a friend who went off her psychiatric medication and started taking weed. She says she's now better. I worry about her. She also tries to encourage everyone to try it.
So she's a marketer for weed.
Yes.
It's such a difficult thing, the fact that it's been legalized. Dagga has been around for ages, for centuries, but we know from experience and from research that Dagga can trigger psychosis. It can trigger schizophrenia. It also causes apathy. So you get a mix, actually, then perhaps in this woman, a mix of psychiatric symptoms and the effects of Dagga, and then you get a whole different picture of what's going on. You never see who the person really is. Okay. And I understand people struggle with prescription medication. I do understand it. And I also understand the doctor's dilemma, because that's their tool, is the medication they prescribe. And we are quick to judge, is it a good doctor or a bad doctor? A good doctor will give you expensive medication that works immediately. You know, we judge doctors by how they treat us and how the medicine works.
And in fairness, they've been trained in a modernist worldview, and they have their 50 minutes to spend with you versus
50,
an hour,
15.
15. Yeah, 1-5.
Yes.
Versus a sort of an hour session that you might have with a therapist or a counselor.
Yes, yes.
And you end up leaving with the prescription.
Exactly, because that's their job. That's their job.
Jo, Rod writes, Jo, in your work, to what extent is your clinical background essential? In other words, to what extent can you engage only in narrative without getting into the clinical picture?
Okay, that's such a good question. Thank you so much for that. Initially, I thought I had to unlearn every single thing that I know, because the client is the expert. That was a bit of a hamstring for me, because, I mean, I have like a general knowledge about psychiatric conditions. So for me, the learning process was that I have the understanding, and it's a kind of a general knowledge, but not to impose this knowledge on the client, but to really offer it. Would it be useful to you if you change your sleeping pattern? Have you tried that? So I can use my knowledge very effectively, but approaching it from a narrative perspective, where as a nurse, guess what I would have said? Luister, mevrou, I think the thing that you have to do is you've got to go to bed at 9 and make sure you take your medication at 8:30. It's still valid, but the way one presents it is completely different.
Almost dehumanizes.
Yes,
the person becomes a patient and not a person.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I now find my basic nursing knowledge very useful. Very, very, very useful, because people come to me and they say, I am bipolar. And I say, wow, what happened? Is that a family name? And we deconstruct it, but I make sure to understand that each person's experience is different. So my nursing knowledge comes in very useful, but it doesn't dominate. The narrative knowledges and the narrative practices now dominate that. But I tell you, when I'm in a corner, guess what's the first thought that comes into my head?
Tell us.
Luister, mevrou, please. You know what? Yeah, that voice comes back. So it's a constant process of learning and unlearning and working out. And when that happens to me and I come with this matron voice, I say to the client, hang on a second, can I please rephrase that question? And I'd like to ask it in this way. And thank goodness narrative is friendly like that.
And it can be humorous too.
Yes.
So the invitation to say, oh, I sound like my mother, let me rephrase that.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Sorry, Mum.
So thanks for that question. That's great.
Are there any more questions that anybody might have for Jo? While we have her in a corner, while we have her in the spotlight.
There's something going on in the chat, but I can't see what it is.
I think that's Leonie. Has the lockdown rules regarding consumption and purchasing of alcohol impacted your clients on their relationship with alcohol?
Very much. Very much. And do you know what happened in Pretoria and in Joburg is that alcohol was now available at the drug dealers.
So you get a 2 for 1.
So people who went to get the booze are now exposed to other merchandise as well. And we saw lots of cross addiction. And when people were prepared to pay exorbitant amounts of money for alcohol, and then, the country ran out of yeast because everyone was making pineapple beer and Mampoer. So, I saw statistics recently that South Africans, I think, become 6th in the world for alcohol consumption.
We really rate high.
It's a very, very big problem in our country. And the lockdown didn't help. It did not help. People went into a panic and started panic buying. And then hoarding. I mean, all this addictive behavior, panic buying, hoarding, spending all your money on that, not budgeting for food or toilet paper. Some budgeted for toilet paper. But it changed a lot of behavior. And people that you wouldn't think would buy illegal alcohol would be purchasing it. From the neighbor who is a high person in the church. It was very interesting how the alcohol crossed boundaries.
It's very normalizing, isn't it?
Very normalized.
Amelia says apps like Checkers 6060 remind you on a Thursday to stock up on alcohol while you buy bread and milk.
Absolutely.
Sure.
Absolutely. Yeah.
What about gender-based violence and abuse? I know it has spiraled during this time, but that as part of an addictive behavior, so I had too much to drink, so I lash out.
I want to share with you while I recently completed an apprenticeship with David Epstein.
Formal
apprenticeship. A very interesting, he based that whole apprenticeship process on our virtual response team from 20 years ago. So what we did there actually opened a way of supervising. He speaks of apprenticing. And in the process, I met with Tom Carlson. And this was right in the beginning of our lockdown. And I asked him, what's happening in Fargo? He was at a university, and he said, we were on high alert. We alerted every single councillor of any kind that people are going to stream in because of anxiety and depression. And actually, in the first lockdown, nothing happened. It was amazing. People settled in and, okay, we're at home now, and had family meals, and it was quite eerie, this first lockdown. Did they ban alcohol here in that lockdown? I can't remember. I think that came, they
did,
So people still had wine in their cellars. They had this lekker, family vibe going. And then people started getting tense. People started losing jobs. The economic situation changed. The panic set in. And then the violence escalated. Where we had happy families before, the violence escalated. The power differentials changed in families. Sometimes the wife still had a job and the husband didn't. Or the wife who had a good income lost her job, and we have to now make do on the husband's job. Or both of us lost our jobs, and now the frustration is, we don't know what to do. So yes, and I think we must be careful to say that gender-based violence is an addiction. I think it's more of a power thing. And I am convinced that people who are trapped in this kind of relationship actually don't want to live like that. But the problem has got them so captivated that they have no idea how to break from that cycle, which is also something that we address at Simcha, because it's very common. It's very common. I always say the woman in the relationship has probably planned 1 million times or more how she will exit without taking the first step.
Mm.
And then, of course, society says, oh, well, she probably likes being beaten because you know what's she doing there? Why doesn't she just take her kids and go?
Mm.
Because they don't understand the power differential and the effect of power in this relationship.
Mm.
Does that answer your question?
It does. It does. And I think I'm aware, because it's one of the most prominent problems I'm seeing in my practice at the moment, is within marriages and relationships. But the role of theology, or patriarchal theology, that also says, well, turn the other cheek, try again. You can't just leave the marriage. It's, you know,
that's right. That's
not
right.
godly.
Yeah.
Heather has a question here. Has there been an increase of abuse from employers on their staff working from home through having unrealistic expectations of their staff?
I don't have statistics. I can only say I would imagine yes. People are so hard up to keep their jobs and to keep earning that it's once again a power differential, where the boss holds all the trump cards and the person working from home must perform. I mean, I have one or two clients who work online, and they told me that the company can watch the movement of the mouse. So if they don't move that mouse, they could be tracked and, you know, what are you doing? It's been 10 minutes since you've done anything on the computer. So people are under a lot more pressure, I think, than they were before. So and then of course, with COVID, you know, and the joys that COVID brought us, it complicated everything. It complicated every single picture that people was presented with. And added to the fear and the desperation.
And almost a sense of that panopticon effect, you know, that self-surveillance, because I need to be available 24/7 when my boss says I need.
Yes,
so
yes. And when you did that with self-surveillance, I must confess, when it was the first lockdown, I sort of kicked against this toilet paper thing. And then one morning I woke up and said, oh my goodness, I hope we'll have enough. I had no idea. Must get toilet paper. And I snuck into Westpac and bumped into a colleague and I said, what are you doing here? She said, please don't tell anybody, I've come to buy toilet paper. And since then, I don't know if any of you've had this experience where you don't just self-surveil, you sort of surveil anybody else in the shops. If they're not wearing a mask, you look at them as if, listen, you are a criminal. I don't know if that's a common experience. Yeah. So we've become very suspicious of one another.
We have. You're standing too close. Could you?
Yes.
Social distancing. And then, Jo, there doesn't seem to be any other questions. So, oh, there was one. Sorry for that, from Rod. I'm really interested to hear more about the way in which David taught you about a flow in questioning, one leading into the next, both with individuals and in group work.
Well, David taught me about individual work. He took me by the hand and showed me word for word, letter for letter. He used to, the client and I used to write him a letter and say, this is what's happening at the moment. And he would, I'm sure he enlarged the letter to a 20 font, and he would always write in capitals, and he would sort of chip into the conversation and write his comments in capitals and ask the questions in capitals. And the way he taught me was I could read it. If I didn't understand it, I could ask him, I could ask the client, we would think about it together. And the most important thing I learned was the position that I take as a therapist. That position is very important. That obviously has carried me through to every single conversation that I've had. The other thing that he taught me is identity, that every single conversation we have is about the client's identity, because the problem usurps and covers and uglies the person's identity, and our job is to unravel that. So yeah, that he taught me, but the questions flowed one into the other. He has asked me to name the type of questions that we've developed. I still haven't gotten around to giving these questions special names, but they would go from a landscape of action to a landscape of identity to a critical question about anorexia to questioning the values and the immorality of anorexia, and to situate it in history and to situate it in Western culture. So it wasn't just this, what is the effect of anorexia on your life? Not at all. He made it so rich that you can go to history and anthropology and poetry and art, and incorporate all of that in your conversations. I'm not sure if I answered the question, but that's how I can explain my experience. I don't know, Rod, does that answer what you wanted to know?
Maybe you could just let us know in the chat box, Rod, if that gives you a better idea about flow. Nothing in the chat box yet.
Oh, okay. I see that there.
Yes,
okay.
Thanks.
Thanks. Okay, great.
Thanks,
great.
Rod. So maybe just as we start drawing our time to a close, Jo, the narrative therapist, the creative therapist, the caregiver, the listener, the teacher, what does Jo, the woman, do for self-care? I've been so aware of the need for it during lockdown and this pandemic.
Yes.
So what do you do?
My favorite thing to do is to ride my motorcycle, but I must confess that I haven't really gone on road trips. Perhaps I'm a little bit tired. Zoom sessions and Zoom teaching exhausts me. I don't know if anybody, it's like, it's extra work. It's not as easy. Plus, my blessed grandchildren moved in here last year, March. So I've also been grade 1 teacher, grade 2 teacher, in between everything. And I must confess that I now love catching a murderer over the weekend. Oh. So I have developed a passion for crime movies. And if it's a series, it's even better. And then I try and figure out who is the murderer. So people think that's very frivolous, but actually it helps me understand how problems work and how sneaky they are.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so that's a great joy for me. This last weekend's one I missed completely. It was out of my ballpark. I didn't see that one coming. Okay. So that's great for me. And spending time with the kids is fantastic. And obviously with my husband, he's an amazing partner. And the two of us motorcycle together. And yeah, maybe we should do a little bit more of that. The other thing that I love is having my 4 disciples around. They are the 2 basset hounds who think they are very funny, but they're not. And the 2 little dogs. So I enjoy their company. And the other thing that I love is reading, but I wish I had more time to read.
What kind of books? What kind of books do you read?
I have been reading a lot of books that Dorian Horov,
yes.
Creative writing books, yeah, to stimulate that part. I often do workshops with him in creative writing. And the other thing that I'm busy with is helping a friend of mine translate an Afrikaans book on bullying into English. Sure. So those are all just fun projects that we do on the side.
Fun projects. Some of them sound like work, Jo.
Yeah, when it's fun, if it's fun, it's fun. You know, it's that's how it is.
Yeah, thank you so much, and just thank you for your time and for being with us this afternoon, and to everybody that joined. A real gratitude for the way that you lead the way, the way that other women can stand on your shoulders, and for all the groundbreaking work that you continue to do. Thank you.
I'm just so grateful that I can do this, and thank you for having me, Nikki. I appreciate it.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you so much, Jo.
You're
Have
welcome.
a great weekend. Thanks, everybody. Hope to see some of you next month when we will be having Sasha Pilkington joining us from New Zealand, and that will be a morning session because it will be her evening. So look forward to seeing some of you then.
Great.
Yeah, very.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jo.
Thank you, guys. Take care.
Have a good weekend.
Bye-bye.
Bye for now.
Bye.